Russia has received another powerful message, and this time it was wrapped up in an explosion that has rocked St. Petersburg to the core. This carefully crafted explosion was aimed at the heart of Russia's logistics, and it completely paralyzed movements, leaving Putin's military supplies stalled and his soldiers stranded. This is yet another act of sabotage in what has been a long, messy war. But the pattern is becoming clearer. By attacking close to St. Petersburg, the Russians are being shown that no place is safe. I mean, just think about it. If Putin's hometown can be crippled, then everywhere can be crippled. So let's dive into what really happened, who pulled it off, and why this one event has Putin pouting like an angry teenager. To see why Moscow is panicking, don't focus on the explosion. Focus on the railway, because that's how Russia has been moving its war. Here's the thing, Russia's railway system isn't just a way to move people and cargo. It's the spine of this country. Everything from food to fuel to troops and tanks depend on it. When you think about how huge Russia is, with freezing winters and endless rough terrain, roads alone could never do the job. The rails hold it all together, like the veins carrying blood through a giant body. If those veins clog or break, the whole system starts to weaken. This isn't a new story. For more than a century, Russian leaders have relied on trains to keep the country connected and under control. The Tsars used them to move soldiers and supplies across their vast empires. The Soviets did the same thing during wars and crisis. Even today, the tracks that stretch from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok are as political as they are practical. Russia has over 105,000 kilometers of active rail lines, making it the third largest rail network in the world. They aren't just metal and gravel, they're a symbol of power and unity. In Russia, control of the rails has always meant control of the land. That deep dependence became even clearer after the invasion of Ukraine. The modern Russian army still operates like its Soviet ancestors, by rail. Nearly 90% of its heavy equipment, including tanks, missiles, artillery shells, and fuel, travel this way. The Western Military District, which includes St. Petersburg, runs almost entirely on that system. The Pskov-St. Petersburg line alone moves thousands of tons of supplies each week, linking it to Kaliningrad and the northern fronts. If that line stops, whole sectors of the war effort freeze with it. And that's what makes what happened next so important, because someone just blew a hole straight through that lifeline. On the 21st of October, an explosion occurred on that same section of the railway line connecting Pskov and St. Petersburg. The attack was meant to cripple the railway line, and it did that beautifully. Witnesses said the night lit up with fire and smoke as the freight train derailed, spilling debris across the tracks. Try as the Russians did to hide the information, details trickled out slowly, as they usually do. And they showed just how big of a mess this was. Even photos that slipped onto Telegram showed torn metal, scorched rails, and security officers pacing the wreckage with flashlights. The location of the blast made it impossible to brush aside. This strategic corridor is just a short distance from Estonia, so this happening so close to a NATO member makes it important. And in Moscow's playbook, that kind of symbolism matters. Now, just like I mentioned, the Pskov corridor is like a lifeline for the Western Military District, the same command zone responsible for Russia's operations near the Baltic states and parts of northern Ukraine. In other words, this line wasn't moving tourists or groceries, it was moving ammunition, fuel, and military cargo, the keys that keep Russia's war machine pumping. The explosion brought everything on that line to a sudden halt. Military shipments stopped, and even civilian trains were rerouted or suspended. For days, Russian logistics teams scrambled to repair the tracks and restore service. But even then, traffic crawled at a fraction of its normal pace. It's hard to measure exactly how much damage a single explosion does in a war this vast, but in logistics, every delay matters. A few days here can mean shortages there, and shortages at the front line can cost lives. Given how Russia's army is already undersupplied, any delay is a huge blow. And these attacks aren't just about the time and the delay factor either. They hit Russia where it hurts, its wallet. Railways carry more than tanks and bullets. They move grain, coal, and oil that keeps the factories humming and the cities fed. A mountain of sanctions already has Russia's economy on edge, and every derailed shipment makes it worse. A 3-day delay might cost millions in lost trade or force factories to slow down, pinching workers who were promised stability. When bread gets pricier because a train didn't arrive on time, people grumble. And when they grumble, the Kremlin story of a strong, united Russia starts to crack. So you see, it's not just soldiers feeling the pinch. It's every Russian wondering what the heck is going on. When the news of this attack broke out, Russian state outlets called it an incident. The local governor even promised swift restoration of order. But people online, they weren't buying it. With Within hours, video surfaced showing thick columns of black smoke rising above the tree line, and emergency workers pulling twisted rail fragments off of the ground. The images spread faster than the sensors could react, and soon the conversation shifted from what happened to how could this happen here? For Moscow, that question cuts pretty deep. St. Petersburg isn't some remote outpost. It's Russia's second city, and the window to Europe. If saboteurs can hit a military railway there, what does that say about the state's grip on its own territory? And when you look even more closely, you'll notice a pattern. Russia's railways have been under quiet attack for months. Since the invasion of Ukraine began, they've turned into one of the quietest but most effective battlegrounds in the entire war. And the more you look at the pattern, the clearer it becomes. This is no random streak of accidents. It's a campaign, slow and deliberate, chipping away at the very thing Russia depends on most, its ability to move. It started quietly, almost invisibly, a signaled glitch here, a short circuit there, then entire sections of tracks began to blow up. By the end of 2023, it was happening so often that Russian authorities stopped reporting on half of them. They started calling them technical failures, a phrase that's now become code for sabotage, but the truth kept slipping through, because explosions leave evidence, and Russian citizens were posting everything online. One of the major early warning signs came in September of 2023. A freight train in Belgorod was ripped off the tracks after explosives were planted along the Stary Oskol to Valiuki line. 11 cars and a locomotive derailed. Russian officials called it a technical glitch, but Ukraine's special forces later claimed it was a deliberate strike. The timing wasn't random. It landed just as Russian units were repositioning near the border, and the disruption forced delays that rippled through the supply chain for days. A few weeks later, another train went down in Ryazan. This time, the explosion triggered a fire and sent police scrambling. Again, the official story leaned on accidental causes, but the location raised eyebrows. Ryazan sits deep inside Russia, far from the front, yet close to key military hubs. Western analysts didn't need much convincing. This was sabotage, plain and simple. From there, the strikes kept moving northwest. By mid-2024, the Pskov to St. Petersburg corridor had become a favorite target. Freight trains carrying fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were hit repeatedly. The method was consistent. Small charges placed under rails, often triggered remotely, always aimed at military cargo. Russian media downplayed the damage, but open-source investigators and Western outlets traced the pattern back to partisan groups and Ukrainian operatives. It wasn't just a few angry saboteurs. It was a campaign. Every time Russia tried to build a new supply route, someone was already waiting to tear it apart. The attacks weren't flashy, but they were effective. They didn't need to destroy entire trains, just stall them long enough to cause trouble, and the trouble kept coming. The rail war has shifted from the edges of the map into the heart of Russia's logistics system, and the Kremlin has been struggling to keep up. By mid-2024, the name Stop the Wagons started circulating online. It wasn't a formal group with a clear leader or headquarters. It was a movement, a loose network of Russians opposed to the war who decided to fight from within. They weren't using guns or drones. They were using wrenches, wires, and explosives small enough to fit in a backpack. The targets weren't soldiers, but the rails those soldiers depended on. By damaging signaling systems or breaking just one joint bar, they could derail an entire train and disrupt supply chains for days. It was resistance on a budget, and it was working. Now Putin had to deal not only with Ukrainian interference, but also his own citizens. Talk about being surrounded, right? And these weren't just the acts of a few angry citizens either. It was a conscious collective of patriots who viewed the invasion as pointless and unnecessary. In Belarus, the same playbook had already been tested months earlier. When Russian troops used Belarusian railways to invade Ukraine in early 2022, local railway workers and activists quietly started sabotaging their own lines. They cut communication cables, jammed sensors, and blocked trains carrying Russian hardware. Some of them were arrested, others vanished, but the idea spread. And once it crossed into Russia, it took on a life of its own. That's what makes the St. Petersburg explosion so symbolic. It's part of a much bigger map of defiance. What started on Belarusian tracks has now reached the industrial heart of Russia itself. Sabotage used to be something Moscow blamed on its neighbors. Now it's happening inside of its own borders, often within a few hundred kilometers of the Kremlin's power center. The attacks have evolved too. They're no longer just about breaking rails. Some hit communication lines that control train traffic. Others target power substations or depots. Each one adds another layer of disruption. And what's worse for Moscow is that these saboteurs keep adapting. After every wave of arrests or crackdowns, the operations come back smarter and faster. You can throw security forces at them, but you can't guard every kilometer of rail in a country that stretches across 11 time zones. On top of that, hitting symbolic targets deep inland sends a message. It tells the Kremlin, if we can reach this close to your core, nowhere is safe. Take the strikes that have been ramping up this year. They're part of something much bigger. And it all started with the Strogo-Novo-Mishinskaya stretch of the Leningrad region, the same corridor that feeds the Pskov-St. Petersburg line. On September 14th, 2 freight trains derailed within hours of each other. The first hit in the Gatchina district. Locals heard a loud crack, then silence. And when emergency crews arrived, they found a locomotive flipped over. Unsurprisingly, officials blamed technical issues. But the photos told a different story. The rails were twisted, scorched, and bent in ways that screamed sabotage. Just a few hours later, at around 2:30 a.m., another train was hit on the very same line. This one was hauling fuel tankers that Russia claimed were empty, although Ukrainian sources said they were full of diesel heading for the front. The explosion set off a chain of fires that burned across the tracks as the Russian railways scrambled to contain the mess. They rerouted trains, threw passengers onto buses, and sent repair crews to work under floodlights. But still, the damage was done, and the delays stretched for days. Meanwhile, mobile internet in the area went down almost immediately, a typical move from the Kremlin to stop videos from spreading. However, this was not before a few clips leaked online showing orange flames and black smoke curling into the cold night. Those 2 derailments weren't accidents. Ukrainian intelligence later claimed their special operations forces carried them out alongside local allies, timing the strikes to choke off fuel supplies right when Russia was preparing fresh pushes in Ukraine. The hit landed hard. Russian logistics teams were forced to reroute supplies through back roads that turned to mud by midday. Fuel trucks burned through more diesel just trying to deliver it. Factories near St. Petersburg slowed production. Workers were sent home early. And whispers started spreading that these lines' technical failures were beginning to look too deliberate. Then came October 7th. That same railway stretch was hit again, this time in broad daylight. A freight train loaded with military cargo, ammunition, spare parts, and maybe even drone components was blown off the rails by charges planted with precision. The FSB came down hard after that, locking down the site and rounding up railway staff for questioning. But the damage was already done. The supplies meant for the front were now useless, rusting under autumn rain. Commanders were forced to shift to truck convoys, crawling over potholed roads, wasting time and fuel that they could not afford to lose. That October hit was the breaking point. It capped off a brutal month that exposed a clear pattern. Someone was targeting the same weak spot over and over, daring Russia to keep patching it up. Each blast came closer to St. Petersburg doorstep, showing that these attackers weren't just testing defenses, they were wearing them down. By the time this latest October 21st explosion tore through the Pskov corridor, it didn't even feel like a surprise anymore. It felt like the inevitable result of a system stretched too thin to defend itself. And now it's rumored that there are more to the saboteurs' arsenal than just wrenches and explosives. Certain sources say that this latest explosion wasn't just about dynamite under the tracks. They speculated that it might have had a digital shadow. Here's the thing, Russia's railways rely on more than steel and wheels. They're wired with sensors, signals, and digital controls that keep the trains moving. Mess with those and you can stop a train without lighting a single fuse. A clever hacker could jam a signal system, trick a sensor into thinking a track is blocked, or even shut down a power substation remotely. This isn't blind speculation. On August 6th of this year, hackers reportedly disrupted the St. Petersburg-Moscow Railway, targeting dispatch systems, ticketing, and network infrastructure. Ukraine's Center for Strategic Communications reported that this attack caused up to $10 million in damage. That is crazy. And yet, it is evidence of the success of this new form of warfare. If the St. Petersburg blast had a digital assist, it would mean the attackers are now playing a smarter game than anyone ever thought. This is hybrid warfare in action. Part physical, part digital, all trouble. Ukraine's been honing these tactics for years, blending boots-on-the-ground sabotage with cyber attacks to keep Russia guessing. I mean, think about it. Hack a railway's control system, then plant a bomb for maximum impact. It's like hitting the same target twice without breaking a sweat. And the scary part? Russia's rail network is a sitting duck for this kind of thing. It's massive, sprawling, and not exactly built with cutting-edge cybersecurity. Every mile of track is a potential weak point. Russia's rails aren't just old, they're obsolete tech traps. The Glosnest-dependent signaling on the Pskov lines uses 1990s-era relays, vulnerable to cheap jammers that cost $50 on the dark web. This makes it easy and cheap to disrupt. Moscow has been slow to adapt, and that's a problem when your enemy can strike from a laptop halfway across the globe. If saboteurs are blending bombs with bytes, Russia's got a bigger headache than just patching rails. It needs to patch its digital backbone, something it definitely can't afford to do right now. And the trouble isn't just limited to this front alone, oh no. While partisans work quietly on the railways, Kyiv's teams are hitting much bigger targets: bridges, refineries, and power grids, basically the lifelines that keep Russia's war machine running. Think of it as an infrastructure revenge tour. Each strike is carefully planned, aimed straight at the cash and cargo that fund Putin's invasion. Blow up a bridge, and you don't just stall traffic, you choke off an entire front. Hit an oil depot, and suddenly tanks are sipping from a much shallower tank. It's smart, it's cheap, and it's forcing Moscow's engineers to live in a constant state of panic. And nowhere shows that better than the Kerch Bridge. The 12-mile stretch Putin built across the strait to Crimea like a personal monument. Thrown together in 2018 after Russia seized the peninsula, it's become the country's southern lifeline, funneling troops, tanks, and tons of ammo straight to the fight in Kherson and beyond. Ukraine has had its eyes on it since the beginning. But lately it's gone from a target of opportunity to a recurring headline. It started with a truck bomb in October of 2022. That buckled the road deck and sent chunks of bridge crashing into the sea. Traffic stopped for months. Then came July of 2023, when a swarm of drones pounded the pillars, forcing emergency repairs. But the real blow landed on June 3, 2025, when underwater drones packed with TNT detonated beneath the supports. Ukraine security services took credit almost immediately, releasing footage of the blast at 4:44 a.m., flames boiling up through the water like a bad omen. That single hit cut Crimea's supply flow by 40% for weeks, stranding fuel convoys and starving frontline units of supplies. Putin poured billions into floating barriers and anti-drone nets, but Ukraine's divers kept finding ways through. It's the kind of strike that doesn't just damage steel, it mocks the very symbol of his control. And the Kerch Bridge is only part of a much bigger picture. Ukraine's drones have been sweeping across Russia's energy map all year, lighting up refineries and depots that bankroll the war effort. The campaign ramped up in early 2024 when strikes on Rosneft's Ryazan refinery knocked out production for weeks and sent fuel prices climbing. This year, the pace has exploded, no pun intended. In March, a drone hit a depot in Krasnodar, wiping out 4% of Russia's refining capacity in a single quarter. Then on the 19th of October, the massive Orenburg gas complex, responsible for handling 45 billion cubic meters a year from Kazakhstan fields, was hit hard, halting exports and forcing costly reroutes. But what makes all of this so effective is not that it's random. It's strategy. Ukraine's military intelligence sees infrastructure as the soft spot in Russia's armor. The army may be massive, but without fuel, power, and working bridges, it's a beast that starves. Each hit on the supply chain bleeds directly into the battlefield. A grounded Kerch convoy means fewer shells in Avdiivka. A burned-out refinery means higher fuel costs for T-90 tanks. The message is clear and familiar. Nowhere is untouchable, not even the Tsar's old homeland. For Putin, it's more than just a logistical headache, it's a blow to both his ego and his economy. Billions are being poured into repairs, exports are shrinking, and ordinary Russians are the ones paying more at the pump. This isn't just slowing trains, it's slowing the entire war. And Ukraine's betting that if it keeps squeezing these pressure points, Russia's war machine will stall out long before theirs ever does. So far, that bet looks like it's paying off, one boom at a time. But it's not just about broken tracks or hacked systems. This kind of chaos cuts deeper, shaking the trust that holds Russia together. These railway attacks are more than just explosions. They're symptoms of a bigger disease. They show that the state's security bubble is shrinking. For years, the Kremlin projected an image of absolute control, of being able to crush dissent before it even formed. But now, even in the north, even in the cities that built Russia's industrial might, that control is fading. You can feel it in the tone of the government's responses. The calm confidence, it's gone. What's left is denial mixed with panic. That's why the St. Petersburg blast hits differently. This wasn't just another act of sabotage. It was proof that Russia's war is no longer confined to the battlefields in Ukraine. It's bleeding back home. Every attack on the rails is like a mirror held up to the Kremlin's failures. You can patch a track, but you can't patch fear. And now, fear is spreading faster than the trains that used to run on time. But after this latest attack, Moscow's not going to sit quietly after a blast like this. The Kremlin's already rolling out more cameras, more patrols, and more informants to watch every inch of track. But here's the catch. Guarding thousands of miles of railway is like trying to babysit a tornado. They might install new sensors or AI to monitor signals, but saboteurs are already one step ahead, mixing low-tech bombs with high-tech hacks. Russia could pour billions into fortifying its railways, but every ruble spent there is one less for the front lines. It's a trap. and Moscow's walking right into it. The Kremlin's already paranoid, and incidents like this could push them to crack down harder. More arrests, stricter laws, and maybe even forcing rail workers to report every suspicious glance. That's a recipe for backlash. And there's already talk on X, formerly Twitter, about locals resenting heavy-handed security sweeps. If the FSB starts hauling in innocent workers or tightening conscription to guard infrastructure, it could spark more anger than they're ready for. And then there's the intelligence game. The FSB is doubling down on sting operations, but catching saboteurs isn't easy when they're decentralized and blend into the crowd. Russia might start leaning on digital surveillance, like tracking phones or hacking Telegram groups, but that risks alienating tech-savvy citizens who already dodge state censors. Every countermeasure has a cost, and the more Moscow tightens the screws, the more it fuels the very resistance it's trying to crush. The St. Petersburg blast didn't just break a railway. It might have started a cycle that's harder to stop than anyone ever expected. All this scrambling to lock things down doesn't just strain Russia's security, it's starting to reshape the entire war. The strategic consequences of all of this are massive. The St. Petersburg explosion didn't just block one route. It highlighted how fragile Russia's internal mobility has become. If supply lines can be crippled from within, then no amount of military buildup abroad will matter. Modern wars aren't won by who fires the most shells. They're won by who can keep their logistics intact. On that front, Russia's losing ground pretty dang fast. The real question now isn't how the rails keep blowing up. It's who's behind it. And the answer, unfortunately, isn't simple. Now, at the top of that list is obviously Ukraine. Ukraine's intelligence agencies like the GUR and the SBU have been carrying out covert operations deep inside Russia for years now. It isn't just military bases that they target anymore. Supply lines, depots, and critical infrastructure are part of a new, more ambitious strategy. The goal is to hit Russia where it hurts the most, without putting soldiers on the ground. Sabotaging a railway is cheaper, less visible, and often more effective than shelling a base. Western intelligence officials have been hinting at this shift for months, and the St. Petersburg line is a textbook example. It hits at logistics, strikes near a symbolic location, and sends a clear message without firing a single conventional round. But it's not just Ukraine. Deep inside of Russia, resistance is growing, and it is decentralized. These are ordinary people who oppose the war, forming networks that are small, nimble, and largely anonymous. Some act independently of Kyiv, but the goal is the same: disrupt Russia's war machine. They are partisans in every sense of the word, and they have become surprisingly effective. The tools they use are simple: homemade explosives, rail tampering, and basic cyber interference. Nothing high-tech, nothing flashy, but deadly effective. They operate quietly, often under the radar, and that makes them harder to catch than any conventional army. The Kremlin knows this, and it terrifies them. In fact, it does its best not to acknowledge this. Russia's public statements are the usual predictable ones. Moscow blames foreign agents, Ukrainian terrorists, and sometimes, conveniently, imaginary saboteurs. The messaging keeps changing because there's no single story that can explain all of this. Behind the scenes, the FSB is trying to track these networks, but they're spread out, adaptive, and often invisible until an explosion hits. Social media has made things worse for Moscow. Locals post videos of damaged tracks and derailed trains and burned cargo before the state censors can intervene. Each clip is a small humiliation. Every successful attack is evidence that the Kremlin cannot control everything. The very fact that this footage of the St. Petersburg blast circulated widely is a symptom of the problem. People see the damage and the chaos, and it undermines the confidence in the government's ability to secure its own territory. The impact goes beyond infrastructure. It shakes morale inside Russia. Soldiers start to question whether supplies will arrive. Commanders wonder if reinforcements can move. And civilians lose faith in the state's promises. The attacks highlight a central truth. Russia may control the battlefield abroad, but it is losing control at home. And that's why the question of who is behind these incidents matters so much. Ukrainian agencies are capable, but the rise of domestic resistance adds a new, unpredictable layer. The people setting the explosives in Pskov or near Novgorod are not following a strict command structure. They are improvising, innovating, and acting on their own instincts. That makes them harder to anticipate, harder to suppress, and far more dangerous in the long term. Every security sweep risks alienating people who might otherwise stay silent. Every arrest feeds the narrative that the regime is weak and paranoid. In the end, the St. Petersburg railway disruption is not just about who pulled the trigger. It's about what it represents: a system under pressure, a government struggling to maintain control, and a population quietly testing the limits of authority. The blast may have been a single moment of destruction, but it's part of a much larger story. One that's still unfolding, and one that Moscow cannot fully contain. Then there's the question of Putin himself. The security services and military brass aren't blind. An explosion in his hometown, under their watch, isn't just a breach. It's a bruise to the myth of control. It stings. Not just because of the damage, but because of what it suggests. That the system built to protect the strong man is starting to miss. Questions start to rise. Are the FSB informants asleep? Are commanders stretched too thin to secure their own backyard? If saboteurs can strike this close to St. Petersburg, what else is slipping through the cracks? These aren't just tactical failures, they're reputational ones. In a regime built on fear and precision, reputation is currency. Nobody's saying Putin is on shaky ground, not yet, but the whispers are growing. Because when your own security team can't stop a bomb on a railway, the question isn't just who did it, it's who's watching. The longer this pattern continues, the more likely it is that the Kremlin's inner circle starts asking the quiet question out loud. Has the boss lost his edge? On the global stage, while Russia rushes to repair its damaged rails, the rest of the world is watching carefully. What's happening near St. Petersburg isn't just a local problem. It's a glimpse into how power and weakness play out in a modern world. Wars today don't stay contained. A single blast can ripple across continents, through markets, and straight into war rooms. For NATO and the Baltic states, this explosion wasn't just another headline, it was a warning. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have spent 2 years preparing for every possible threat, from cyber attacks and drone strikes to refugee waves. But sabotaging this close to St. Petersburg changes the picture. It shows that Russia's internal security is under strain and that chaos inside its borders can spread outward pretty fast. Military planners in Tallinn and Warsaw are already running simulations, asking a new kind of question. If Moscow can't protect its own transport network, what happens if something similar occurs near the frontier? Because in a region filled with mistrust, even one broken rail can be misread as an act of war. For NATO intelligence teams, these rail attacks are now part of a bigger pattern. They're tracking every explosion through satellite images, intercepted radio chatter, and heat signatures from burning carriages. What they're seeing isn't just sabotage. It's a sign of fatigue deep inside of Russia's war machine. In modern conflict, logistics are everything. The side that keeps supplies moving faster and more securely usually wins. And Russia's lifeline, its rail system, is looking shakier by the day. Each delay near St. Petersburg sends the same quiet message to NATO generals. Russia's power has limits. That message travels pretty quickly, from military command centers to parliaments and financial institutions across the West. The more those limits become clear, the more confident NATO feels about tightening the pressure and funding Ukraine. Every burnt freight car, every halted train is read not just as a tactical victory for saboteurs, but as proof that the Kremlin's strength is fading. In Washington, Brussels, and London, that shift in perception has real consequences. What once looked like a long, grinding war is starting to look winnable. Western leaders who were once cautious about escalation are now more willing to send advanced weapons and financial aid. Investors and policymakers who used to worry about provoking Russia now see an opportunity to end the war faster by helping Ukraine push harder. The strategy has changed from containment to acceleration, to keep the pressure on, force the cracks wider, and make Russia's position unsustainable. To NATO strategists, Russia's railway map now looks like a heartbeat monitor. Each new explosion is another pulse, showing that the system is weakening. And in quiet meetings from Brussels to Washington, that pattern is being studied closely. Some are beginning to believe that this war doesn't need to freeze in stalemate. It can actually be finished. Meanwhile, China is watching all of this with quiet concern. For Beijing, those Russian railways aren't just about moving troops. They're trade arteries that connect China to Europe through the northern branch of the Belt and Road project. Every derailment and every hacked signal system threatens that route. When an explosion near Pskov halts shipments for days, Chinese logistics firms feel it. It's already prompting Beijing to shift some cargo towards safer routes, like the Caspian corridor through Kazakhstan, or the Middle Corridor via Turkey. Russia's instability is quietly redrawing the trade map of Eurasia, and not to its advantage. Europe is also feeling the economic tremors. Despite sanctions, Russia still exports massive amounts of oil, coal, and grain by rail. When one of those lines goes down, insurance costs jump, deliveries slow, and commodity prices shift. Every technical incident near St. Petersburg or Novgorod sends small waves through fuel and grain markets. In an already tense global economy, that kind of uncertainty hits everyone, from energy traders in Amsterdam to millers in Cairo. What used to be a military setback is now an economic risk. Even countries far from Europe are paying attention. Nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that rely on Russian grain and fertilizer can now see how fragile those supply chains really are. A single explosion in northern Russia could mean higher food prices thousands of miles away. It's a reminder that in today's world, no war stays local. A rail blast near St. Petersburg can ripple all the way to supermarket shelves in Sao Paulo or Lagos. But beyond economics, it's also about image. For decades, Russia prided itself on being the master of logistics, the country that could move armies, build pipelines, and operate across impossible distances. Now, videos of derailed trains and burning freight cars are chipping away at that image. The myth of total control? It's cracking. And in geopolitics, perception matters as much as reality. When Russia looks weak at home, its influence fades abroad. Allies become cautious, and rivals grow bolder. In Washington and Brussels, analysts see the sabotage wave as more than a nuisance. It's a turning point. The thinking is pretty simple. If Russia's railways are this vulnerable, then its ability to sustain the war is limited. That's why many are calling this the logistics war. It's being fought not in trenches, but across the supply lines that feed the battlefield. In this new kind of conflict, saboteurs and hackers can be as decisive as soldiers. Even neutral powers like India and Turkey are quietly recalculating. Both have walked a fine line between Moscow and the West. But if Russia's transport system keeps breaking down, its reliability as a partner comes into question. Trade, investment, and even diplomatic promises all depend on stability. And right now, Russia's rails are telling a story of anything but stability. So while Moscow points fingers at foreign agents and scrambles to fix its broken network, the world is already drawing its own conclusions. The real question isn't who set off the blasts, it's what it revealed. Russia's economy, reputation, and military power all run on the same fragile tracks. When those tracks fail, the shock doesn't stop at Russia's borders. It travels through markets, alliances, and global calculations. The St. Petersburg Railway didn't just break. It sent a message that the whole world heard loud and clear. At the end of the day, the situation is more than a railway incident. It's a signpost pointing to the deeper realities of modern Russia. It shows that power abroad depends on stability at home. It proves that infrastructure is a battlefield just as crucial as the front lines. And it leaves one question in the air, sharp and undeniable. If the trains cannot run, how can the empire hold together? You've probably noticed this already, but every time we try to show you what's actually happening on the front lines of this war, YouTube either demonetizes the video or just flat out blocks it. We've had videos taken down for simply showing the truth. Not propaganda, not fake clips, but verified footage analyzed with the help of real veterans. Meanwhile, the same mainstream media that claims to care about transparency won't even show you what Russian missiles are really doing to Ukrainian cities. That's why I built Basics Insider, our own platform, completely independent from YouTube and free from censorship. It's where we share frontline clips, deep analysis from veterans, and reports you'll never see on mainstream news. This isn't about clicks or views. It's about documenting the truth before it disappears behind the algorithms and the politics. And the only reason we're able to keep this website running is because of you, the fans, the viewers, the people who actually care about what's happening. We don't have sponsors, we don't have corporations backing us, just your support. So, if you believe in independent journalism, if you want to see what's really happening, go to basicsinsider.com right now. You can also click on the link in the description or scan the QR code on your screen. Because the war isn't just being fought on the battlefield, it's being fought for the truth.